She hadn't closed her eyes without trembling in weeks. Every morning, the walk to PS 144 in Queens felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The threats were escalating. The danger was documented, and the one thing that made it unbearable? Every authority figure with the power to help had turned their backs. Desperate and abandoned by a broken system, 7-year-old Camila Arias did something that defies every instinct of childhood safety. She walked through the doors of the Iron and Ink Social Club, the headquarters of the most ruthless mafia boss in the tri-state area, and asked Alexander Stevens for the protection no one else would give her. What happened next didn't just end her nightmare. It ripped apart a network of institutional corruption that had been shielding the powerful for years. And when Alexander Stevens and over a dozen of his most feared men formed a wall of ink and muscle at that elementary school gate the next morning, the bullies, their connected families, and every corrupt official realized they'd underestimated the wrong little girl. Before we dive into Camila's extraordinary act of courage, I want to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. This story about a child's desperate bravery, unexpected protectors, and justice against a rigged system, it resonates everywhere. It crosses every border and every background. And I want to see how far Camila's message of standing up to corruption reaches today. All right, let's go back to where Camila's terror began. Camila Arias was 7 years old when her world started shrinking. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, though he'd been gone since she was 3. What she had all her own was a gift for color. She could turn a blank page into something that made the guidance counselor at PS 144 stop mid-stride and stare. Butterflies that seemed to lift off the paper. Sunsets that looked like they were melting into the East River. Her teacher, Mrs. Chin, kept a folder of Camila's work in her desk drawer like they were treasure maps. Her mother, Rosa Arias, worked double shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital as a nursing assistant. She'd leave before dawn and return after dark, but she never missed reading to Camila before bed. Never missed asking about her drawings. Never missed braiding her daughter's hair each morning before walking her 3 blocks to school. That walk used to be Camila's favorite part of the day. Then Thomas Marino noticed her. Thomas was 12, but he carried himself like he owned the sidewalk. His father ran protection rackets through half of Queens. His uncle sat on the local community board. His older brother had just made captain in his father's crew. Thomas and his friends, Marco DeLuca and Jimmy Rizzo, sons of equally connected families, ruled the blocks around PS 144 like it was their inheritance. It started small. A shove in the hallway that sent Camila's sketchbook flying, pages scattering like wounded birds. Laughter when she scrambled to collect them. Then it wasn't small anymore. They tore her butterfly drawing in half during recess, right in front of her. Called her charity case, loud enough for everyone to hear. Started a rumor that her mother cleaned toilets at the hospital, twisting Rosa's honest work into something shameful. Within 2 weeks, the other kids stopped sitting with Camila at lunch. They'd learned that being her friend meant becoming a target. Camila stopped bringing her sketchbook to school. Then she stopped drawing altogether. The colors that used to pour out of her pencils just stayed locked inside, fading like bruises no one could see. Rosa noticed the visible bruises first. A purple bloom on Camila's upper arm that hadn't been there at breakfast. Then another on her shin. When Rosa asked about them, Camila whispered that she'd fallen on the playground. The lie sat between them like something rotten. The physical intimidation had started the week before. Thomas and his crew had cornered Camila near the bike racks after school, close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on Jimmy Rizzo's jacket. Thomas had grabbed her backpack and dumped everything onto the concrete. When she bent to pick up her things, Marco DeLuca kicked her pencil case into the street. They didn't hit her. They didn't need to. The threat was clear in how close they stood, how they blocked every exit. The next incident left the bruise. Thomas had accidentally slammed into Camila in the stairwell, sending her into the metal railing hard enough that she couldn't lift her arm without wincing for 3 days. Rosa took off work early and marched into PS 144 that Thursday afternoon. She waited 20 minutes outside Principal Henderson's office, her hospital scrubs still smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. When Henderson finally called her in, his smile was practiced and empty. Rosa laid it out clearly. The destroyed artwork, the verbal harassment, the escalating physical contact. She even had the names: Thomas Marino, Marco DeLuca, Jimmy Rizzo. She had witnesses. She had dates. Henderson listened with his hands folded on his desk like he was humoring a child. When Rosa finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and sighed with theatrical patience. "Mrs. Arias, I understand your concern. But you have to understand the delicate position this school is in. The families you're mentioning, they've been very generous to our programs. Very prominent in the community. These are good kids from good families. Sometimes children have conflicts. Sometimes they misunderstand social dynamics." Rosa's voice hardened. "My daughter has bruises. Kids get bruises, Mrs. Arias. They play rough. They fall." Henderson stood, a clear dismissal. "I think it's best if Camila focuses on adjusting better. Perhaps she's being oversensitive. Making friends can be challenging for some children." He walked her to the door, his hand on her shoulder feeling more like a threat than comfort. "We wouldn't want to create unnecessary problems, would we? These families have considerable influence. I'm sure you understand." Rosa understood perfectly. She was being warned to stay silent. The 109th precinct was 8 blocks from their apartment. Rosa walked there on her day off, carrying a folder with everything she'd documented. Dates, times, witnesses, the medical photos she'd taken of Camila's bruises on her phone. She'd even written down the names of the families involved, their known connections, everything that might matter. Detective Carlos Ruiz was assigned to her case. He was in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a coffee-stained tie. He took her report with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd heard 1,000 complaints and expected nothing to change. He wrote down names without reaction, nodded when she showed him the photos, asked perfunctory questions in a monotone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Arias," he said, sliding her folder into a drawer that looked like where reports went to die. "Someone will be in touch." 2 days passed. Then Ruiz called. His voice on the phone was different, colder. The practiced indifference had been replaced by something sharper, more deliberate. "Mrs. Arias, I've reviewed your complaint. I've made some inquiries." Rosa felt her chest tighten. And I'm advising you to drop this matter. The families you're accusing, the Marinos, the DeLucas, the Rizzos, they're well established in this community. Respected. Your allegations are serious, and frankly, they're not supported by sufficient evidence. I gave you photos. I gave you witnesses. Kids get into altercations, Mrs. Arias. That's not criminal assault. What concerns me is that you're making accusations that could be considered defamatory against prominent families. Families with resources. Families with lawyers. He paused, letting the threat settle. "I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Stop making trouble. For your own sake. For your daughter's sake. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Rosa's hand trembled against the phone. "You're supposed to protect us. I'm protecting you from making a mistake you can't take back. Drop it. Move on. That's my professional advice." He hung up before she could respond. Rosa stood in her kitchen, the dial tone buzzing in her ear, and realized that the badge meant nothing. The law meant nothing. The system that was supposed to protect her daughter was actively protecting the people hurting her instead. If you can't stand people who abuse their power like Principal Henderson and Detective Ruiz, hit subscribe right now. Only those who side with corruption won't. The escalation came the following Monday, and it came with a message that couldn't be misunderstood. Camila was leaving school when she saw him. A man in his early 20s, leaning against a black Mercedes parked directly across from the PS 144 gates. He had Thomas Marino's same sharp jawline, the same cold eyes. But where Thomas was still learning cruelty, this man had perfected it. Vincent Marino, Thomas's older brother. Already a made man in his father's organization at 23. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. He just watched Camila walk past, his phone raised, taking photos. Click, click, click. The sound felt louder than it should have been. Rosa picked Camila up that day and saw Vincent immediately. Saw the way he smiled when he noticed Rosa noticing him. Saw him take another photo, this time of both of them together. Then he climbed into his Mercedes and drove away slowly, like he had all the time in the world. The next day, Vincent was there again. Same spot. Same phone. Same deliberate, unhurried photography. This time he followed them for 3 blocks before turning off, maintaining a distance that was just close enough to be terrifying. Rosa's hands shook so badly that night she could barely dial Detective Ruiz's number. He answered on the 4th ring. "Mrs. Arias, I thought I made myself clear. Thomas Marino's older brother is stalking my daughter. He's taking photos of her outside her school. He's following us home. You need to do something. Right now." Silence on the other end. Then Ruiz sighed like she'd just asked him to move a mountain with a spoon. "Mrs. Arias, taking photographs in public isn't a crime. If he's not threatening you, if he's not touching you, there's nothing I can do. He's a grown man photographing a 7-year-old girl. He's following us. Unless he's violating a restraining order, which you don't have, I can't help you. And let me be very clear, you will not get a restraining order against Vincent Marino. No judge in Queens is going to grant that. You're wasting my time and yours. Stop calling me." The line went dead. Rosa stood in her living room, phone still pressed to her ear, feeling the last thread of hope snap. She'd done everything right, followed every rule, trusted every institution, and every single one had looked her in the eye and chosen the predators over her child. That night, Camila woke up to the sound of her mother crying. Not the quiet tears she sometimes heard through the walls. This was something else. Something broken. Deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere vital. Camila pressed her ear to her bedroom door and listened to her mother weep from utter defeat. Listened to the sound of someone who'd fought every fight and lost them all. Listened to the moment when hope died. And in that moment, 7-year-old Camila Arias understood something that no child should ever have to understand. No one was coming to save them. Camila lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while her mother's sobs echoed through the thin apartment walls. She thought about Principal Henderson's practiced smile, about Detective Ruiz's cold dismissal, about Vincent Marino's phone clicking away, documenting her fear like it was something he could frame and hang on his wall. Everyone who was supposed to protect her was afraid of the same people who were hurting her. But there was someone in the neighborhood who no one was afraid of. Someone who made the Marinos cross the street. Someone whose name people whispered like a curse or a prayer depending on which side of his attention you were on. Alexander Stevens. The man who ran the Iron and Ink Social Club 3 blocks from her school. The man her mother had once warned her to never, ever approach. The man who, according to neighborhood legend, had once made 2 grown men apologize to an elderly woman they'd scammed, and when they refused, those men were never seen in Queens again. The clarity hit Camila like cold water. The system wouldn't help because the system belonged to families like the Marinos. But Alexander Stevens didn't belong to anyone. He was the thing that made dangerous men nervous. She waited until morning. Waited until her mother left for her early shift at the hospital, exhausted and red-eyed. Then Camila took out her colored pencils for the first time in weeks and wrote a note in careful block letters on the back of one of her old drawings, the butterfly one that Thomas had torn in half, that she'd taped back together and hidden in her desk. "Dear Mom, I want to get help from someone who isn't scared. I love you. I'll be safe. I promise. Camila." She left the note on the kitchen table, put on her backpack, and walked out the door 2 hours before school started. The Iron and Ink was located in a converted warehouse on a street where the businesses didn't advertise and the windows were tinted dark. Camila had walked past it 100 times, always on the opposite sidewalk, always with her mother's hand gripping hers a little tighter until they were safely past. Now she stood directly in front of the heavy steel door with its iron handle shaped like a coiled serpent. There was no sign, no hours posted. Just an address painted in faded numbers above the frame. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to run home, to hide under her bed, to be a good girl who followed rules and trusted adults. But good girls who followed rules got ignored. Good girls who trusted adults got photographed by predators while the police did nothing. Camila reached up, grabbed the iron serpent with both hands, and pulled the door open. The sound of her mother's weeping still echoed in her memory. That sound made the choice easy. She stepped inside. Detective Ruiz represents a broken system. Comment, I stand for justice if you believe authorities should protect children, not the powerful. The interior of the Iron and Ink smelled like leather, coffee, and something sharper, cologne mixed with the metallic tang of old smoke. The main room was larger than Camila expected, with exposed brick walls and low lighting that made every shadow seem deliberate. A dozen men sat scattered throughout the space, some at tables, others standing near a bar that ran the length of the back wall. Every single one of them was covered in tattoos. Ink crawled up their necks, wrapped around their forearms, disappeared under shirt collars and patterns that looked like they told stories Camila couldn't read. And every single one of them stopped what they were doing the moment she walked in. The silence was immediate and total. Conversations died mid-sentence. A man setting down a coffee cup froze with it still inches from the table. Someone near the back straightened like he'd been struck. At the far end of the room, sitting in a leather chair that might as well have been a throne, was Alexander Stevens. He was exactly how the neighborhood described him. Dark hair slicked back, sharp features that looked carved from something harder than flesh, and tattoos that covered his neck and hands in intricate designs. He wore a tailored suit jacket over an open collar, a silver chain visible against his skin. His eyes were the kind of dark that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Those eyes locked onto Camila, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. But she'd come too far to stop now. She'd listened to her mother cry. She'd watched Vincent Marino photograph her like she was prey. She'd felt Principal Henderson's warning hand on her shoulder and heard Detective Ruiz tell her that predators were more important than her safety. Camila walked forward. Every step felt like it echoed in the silent room. The men parted without a word, creating a path straight to Alexander Stevens. She stopped 3 feet from his chair and looked up at him. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, studying her with an intensity that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. "My name is Camila Arias," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted but steady. "I'm 7 years old, and I need your help." Then she told him everything. About Thomas Marino and his crew. About the destroyed drawings and the bruises and the way no one would sit with her at lunch anymore. About Principal Henderson dismissing her mother with threats disguised as advice. About Detective Ruiz telling them to stop making trouble. About Vincent Marino stalking her outside school, taking photographs, following them home. About her mother crying last night like something inside her had shattered. She didn't cry while she spoke. She'd cried enough. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the time for truth. When she finished, Alexander Stevens hadn't moved, hadn't interrupted, hadn't looked away from her face. Camila took one shaking breath and asked the question that had brought her here. "Will you please walk me to school just so the bad people know they can't hurt me anymore?" The silence stretched. Then Alexander Stevens stood, and the room seemed to shift with him. He looked down at Camila, and something in those dark eyes had changed. Something cold had been replaced by something burning. "Yes," he said simply. "I will." If you believe that even the darkest characters can choose to protect the innocent, show your support for Alexander Stevens' decision by giving this video a like. Alexander made the call himself. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a number one of his men had retrieved in minutes, and dialed Rosa Arias while Camila sat in the chair he'd vacated, drinking orange juice one of the tattooed men had brought her without being asked. Rosa answered on the first ring, her voice frantic. "Camila? Baby, where are you?" "Mrs. Arias, my name is Alexander Stevens. Your daughter is safe. She's with me at the Iron and Ink." He spoke calmly, precisely, the way someone speaks when they know their words carry weight. "She came to me this morning and told me about your situation. About the Marino family. About the principal. About Detective Ruiz." Silence on the other end. Then, barely a whisper. "Please don't hurt her." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Arias, I'm not the one who's been hurting your daughter. That's why she's sitting in front of me right now instead of walking to school terrified. She had nowhere else to turn. Do you understand what that means?" A 7-year-old child felt safer walking into a room full of criminals than trusting the people with badges and authority. Rosa's breath caught. "I tried everything." "I know you did. Your daughter told me. And I'm telling you now, this is not business. This is principle. What's happening to Camila? What happened to you? That corruption, that abuse of power, I won't tolerate it. Not in my neighborhood. What are you going to do? Tomorrow morning, I will personally walk your daughter to school. And I won't be walking alone. The Marinos, their friends, everyone who thought they could terrorize a child because the system protected them, they're going to learn that protection has limits." Rosa was crying now, but these were different tears. "Why? Why would you do this?" Alexander glanced at Camila, who was watching him with those wide, dark eyes that had seen far too much. "Because someone should have done it already. Because the badge failed. Because power without principle is just tyranny." He paused. "Your daughter is brave, Mrs. Arias. Braver than most men I know. She deserves to feel safe walking 3 blocks to school." The next morning, Rosa and Camila stepped out of their apartment building at 7:45 a.m. to find Alexander Stevens waiting at the curb. He wasn't alone. Behind him, arranged in 2 perfect lines, stood 14 men. Every single one wore a black suit. Every single one bore tattoos that crept up their necks and covered their hands. Every single one stood with military precision, utterly silent, utterly still. Alexander approached Camila and knelt to her eye level. He held out a small jacket, child-sized, pristine, with a single word embroidered on the back in silver thread, "Protected." "Ready?" he asked. Camila nodded and slipped on the jacket. It fit perfectly. Alexander stood, offered Camila his hand, and turned toward PS 144. His men fell into formation around them, a moving wall of ink, muscle, and absolute, terrifying certainty. The walk to PS 144 took 7 minutes. It felt like a procession. Like a storm moving through the neighborhood with deliberate, unstoppable force. People stopped on the sidewalk. A woman watering her plants froze with the hose still running. A man getting into his car stood with his door open, keys forgotten in his hand. Car traffic slowed. Someone dropped their coffee. The sound of 15 pairs of dress shoes hitting pavement in perfect synchronization was the only noise for blocks. No one spoke. No one dared. Thomas Marino and his crew were waiting near the school gates like they did every morning, scanning for Camila. Marco DeLuca saw them first. His face went white. He grabbed Thomas's arm and pointed. Thomas turned and the color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might faint. Vincent Marino was there too, leaning against his Mercedes with his phone out, ready for another day of stalking. He saw the approaching formation and his phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the pavement. They ran. All 3 of them. Thomas and Marco sprinted toward the back of the school building. Vincent dove into his Mercedes and peeled away from the curb so fast his tires screamed. The community watched it happen. Parents dropping off their children. Teachers arriving for the day. The crossing guard who'd seen Camila terrorized for weeks. They all witnessed the bullies flee like rabbits from wolves. Alexander and his men didn't pursue. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Principal Henderson was standing outside the main entrance when they arrived. He'd heard the commotion, seen the formation approaching. When his eyes met Alexander's, his practiced smile evaporated. His legs visibly trembled. He took 3 steps backward, retreating through the doors without a word. The school gates stood open. Beyond them, the familiar courtyard where Camila had been shoved, insulted, isolated. Where her drawings had been destroyed. Where her fear had grown until it consumed everything. Alexander knelt beside her one more time. "You walk through those gates yourself," he said quietly. "You walk in with your head up. You show them what courage looks like." Camila looked up at him, then at the men standing in silent formation behind her. She thought about her mother's tears. About Principal Henderson's dismissal. About Detective Ruiz's threats. About all the people who'd told her to be quiet, to accept it, to let the powerful do whatever they wanted. She adjusted the jacket with "protected" embroidered across the back, took a breath, and walked through the gates of PS 144 with her head held high. Behind her, Alexander Stevens and his men stood like sentinels, watching until she disappeared safely inside. The entire neighborhood watched with them. And everyone understood. The rules had just changed. Don't let the fear and intimidation of the bullies win. Subscribe if you agree that no child should ever have to walk to school in fear. The spectacle at PS 144 that morning didn't just end the bullying. It detonated something that had been building pressure in the community for years. By noon, 3 news vans were parked outside the school. By evening, the story was trending on every local news outlet. Mafia boss protects elementary student after system fails her. Alexander Stevens didn't do interviews. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken with absolute clarity. But he did make phone calls. Quiet, deliberate calls to people who owed him favors. To journalists who understood what corruption looked like. To city officials who suddenly remembered they had oversight responsibilities they'd been neglecting. Within 48 hours, the Department of Education launched an investigation into Principal Henderson's handling of bullying complaints at PS 144. Parents who'd been silenced for years came forward with their own stories, other children who'd been tormented while Henderson protected the families with generous contributions. The pattern was undeniable. Henderson resigned on Friday afternoon, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. Detective Ruiz lasted slightly longer. The NYPD Internal Affairs Division received anonymous tips, detailed documentation of incidents he'd buried, families he'd protected, complaints he'd threatened into silence. The evidence was meticulous. Damning. When investigators cross-referenced his bank statements with his case files, the corruption became impossible to deny. Ruiz was reassigned to a desk job in Staten Island pending a full investigation. He'd never wear his badge in Queens again. The Marino family faced something worse than legal consequences. They faced public shame. Every news story mentioned Thomas by name. Mentioned his father's alleged organized crime connections. Mentioned Vincent's stalking of a 7-year-old girl. Their protection had been built on silence and fear. Once those foundations cracked, the entire structure collapsed. Thomas Marino transferred to a private school in New Jersey within 2 weeks. His parents couldn't show their faces at the social clubs that had once welcomed them. Vincent disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. 3 weeks after Alexander Stevens walked Camila to school, PS 144 held a special assembly. The new interim principal, a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor, who'd spent 20 years fighting for marginalized students, invited Camila to speak. Rosa sat in the front row, tears already streaming down her face before Camila even reached the microphone. Alexander Stevens stood in the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, watching with the same intense focus he'd given Camila that first morning in the Iron and Ink. Camila walked to the podium wearing her protected jacket. The assembly fell silent. She looked out at the sea of faces, students, teachers, parents, and saw some of the same kids who'd abandoned her when she became a target. Saw the teachers who'd looked the other way. Saw the community that had let fear make them complicit. She took a breath and spoke. My name is Camila Arias. I'm 7 years old. And I was scared every single day until I decided to stop waiting for adults to fix things. Her voice was small but steady, amplified by the microphone to reach every corner of the room. I went to the principal. I went to the police. My mom tried everything the right way. And nobody helped us. Nobody cared that I was afraid. Nobody cared that bad people were hurting me. She paused, her hands gripping the podium. So I went to someone everyone said was dangerous. And you know what? He was the only person who wasn't afraid to do the right thing. He didn't look away. He didn't make excuses. He just helped. Camila looked directly at the students in the front rows. If someone is hurting you, tell somebody. Tell everybody. Don't stop telling until someone listens. Because you deserve to feel safe. You deserve to go to school without being afraid. And if the people who are supposed to protect you won't do it, she glanced back at Alexander Stevens, who nodded once, then find someone who will. The auditorium erupted in applause. Rosa was sobbing. Teachers were wiping their eyes. Students were standing. And Alexander Stevens, the most feared man in Queens, allowed himself the smallest smile. Camila Arias had found her voice. And the entire community heard it. If you believe in Camila's courage and want more stories of triumph over systemic evil, subscribe and turn on notifications now.